Hello everyone. Today we're going to be discussing conditional statements, more commonly known as if-else statements. So, what are conditional statements? Conditional statements are statements that you can write in your code. These statements will check some condition, and only if this condition is satisfied will they execute the corresponding block of code. Okay, so you'll write a conditional statement. These conditional statements will check some condition whether or not it is satisfied. Only if this condition is satisfied will they execute some corresponding block of code. Otherwise, that block of code will not be executed. Conditional statements or if-else statements allow your computer to take part in a decision-making process. You give your computer some rules or a blueprint based on the conditions that you give to the computer. Now the computer can decide based on these conditions or these rules whether or not it should execute some block of code, right? The computer generally before if else statements wasn't able to do this, right? We would just write code line by line and the computer would have to execute it line by line. It couldn't choose which line to execute or which block of code to execute and which not to execute, right? But now with conditional statements, with if statements or if else statements, it has that power. So let's start with the most basic conditional statement, the if statement. Now, let's look at this code snippet here. So there might be some code before the if statement. Then we reach the if statement. The first word of the if statement should be if. This lets the computer know that what we are now writing is an if statement. The second word is the condition. This is actually a Boolean value or a logical expression. Basically, whatever you write in condition should evaluate to a Boolean value. Then we have a colon, after which we have an indented block of code. This indented block of code is the body of the if condition. So the way it works is that the computer will check whether this condition, this logical expression written in condition, evaluates to a true Boolean. If it does evaluate to a true Boolean, then this indented block of code will be executed. But if it evaluates to a false Boolean, then this indented block of code will be skipped and the execution will move on to the line after this if condition, which is the line shown here at the bottom, and then the code will proceed normally. So this was about the most basic conditional statement, the if statement. Let's see an example to understand this better. So the example is that let's say you are writing a program for a company that calculates salaries for some employees. Okay, you are given a new task that all the employees that have done quote unquote great work should be given 20,000 rupees extra. Okay, so how would you implement this in your code? So let's see how. So there might be some code already in your program, right? So work and salary can be assumed as some variables that are already there in your program. Okay. Now in between this program, you should write this statement that if the work, which is the work done by the employee, is greater than some specific value. Here we have just taken an arbitrary value. So if this work is greater than some specific value, then we can consider this work to be great work. Okay. So if work is greater than some value, then salary should be equal to salary plus 20,000, or salary plus 20,000 should be assigned to salary. Okay. Now when you execute this program, this if statement will check whether the employee has done great work or not, based on whether the work value of the employee is greater than this number given here or not. And if it is, then it will add 20,000 to its salary. So that was the first example. Let's now look at another type of conditional statement, the if-else statement. This if-else statement is really easy to understand now that we know what an if statement is. So basically, there might be some code above this if-else statement. We start off again with an if condition. Okay, so if this condition is true, then the first indented block of code will be executed. After this indented block of code, we write else and then a colon, and then we write another indented block of code. Okay, so the way it works is that if this condition is true, then the first indented block of code will be executed. But if this condition is false, then the program will move into the else part of the code, and the second indented block, or the indented block after else is written, will be executed. Okay, so this is an if else statement, that if the condition is true, then execute the first indented block of code, else execute the second indented block of code. So let's see an example for this too. So the problem given is that you are given some variable x that has some integer value or integer data in it. Okay, you need to print odd if that value is odd, and print even if this value is even. Let's remember one thing, that a number, an integer, is even if it is divisible by 2, which means that the remainder when that number is divided by 2 should be 0. Also, let's remember that to find remainders, we use the modulo or the percentage operator, which we have discussed in our operators video. So now we can move on to the code. The answer for this would be if x mod 2, this value x, which is the variable mod 2, x mod 2 will give the remainder when x is divided by 2. If this remainder is equal to 0, so this remainder should be compared with the value 0. If it is 0, then we know that our number is even, so we should print even. Otherwise, we know that our number will be odd, so we should write else print odd. Fairly simple? Yeah. Now let's move on to another type of conditional statement, the if, elif, else in Python. So elif here is a shortened version of else if. Okay, so the way this works is that we can now have 3 conditions, or even more than 3 decisions, or more than 3 indented blocks of code. Basically, if the first condition is satisfied, if condition 1 is a true boolean, then the block of code written under if will be executed. Okay, and after that code is executed, we'll directly go to the unindented block of code, which is the last line here. Okay, else if condition true is a true value, condition 2 is a true boolean, then the indented block written under elif will be executed, and after it is executed, we will move on to the last line here, which is the rest of the code, the unindented code. And if condition 1 is also not true and condition 2 is also not true, then finally we will reach the else part of the code. So the indented block of code written under else will be executed, and after which again the code will move to the last line here. Okay, so that is how if elif else works. We can now check multiple conditions and then move on to an else. Let's see an example for this to make this more clear. So the example is that we need to compare a variable value num1 with another variable value num2, and and let the user know if num1 is greater than num2, num1 is equal to num2, or num1 is lesser than num2. So that is the problem. So we've learned about logical operators like greater than, equal to, and less than, right? So we can use those here in the conditions for the conditional statements. So let's see what the answer code would be. So here is the code. So if num1 is greater than num2, that means if the first number is greater than the second number, then we should directly print num1 is greater, and then the code will end, right? But if num1 is not greater than num2, then the computer will first check the else if condition or the elif condition. So elif num1 is equal to num2, this boolean will now be evaluated. Num1 is equal to num2. So if num1 is equal to num2, then the computer will print both equal, which means both the numbers are equal, right? But if the first condition doesn't work and the elif condition also doesn't work, then the computer will go to the else condition, which says that print num1 is smaller, right? This makes sense that if num1 is not greater than num2 and num1 is not equal to num2, then num1 has to be smaller than num2. So this was a really simple problem that introduces if, elif, else, right? Now, let's see some other variations of conditional statements in Python. The first variation would be nested ifs. So you can nest if or if else or if, elif, else statements inside if statements. So something like what is shown here, which means if condition 1 holds, then we move on to the indented block of code inside, right? That indented block of code inside could also have an if else statement inside it. So something like if condition 1.1, then there would be an other indented block of code, else do something else. Like this, we can keep making a nest, or we can keep expanding these nested ifs as far deep as we want to. Okay. The other variation is an if elif ladder. So instead of having just one elif condition, we can have multiple elif conditions and then terminate in an else condition if all these if and elif conditions are false. So basically the program will check if C1 holds, then it will try to execute this block of code written below C1. Else if C2 holds, then it will try to execute the block of code below C2. Else if C3 holds, then it will try to execute the block of code below C3, and so on till how many ever elif statements there are. Finally, we can end in an else, which will occur if none of these elif and if statements evaluate to true. And then the block of code written under else can be executed. These variations will become much more clearer when we practice some programs on them. I just wanted to introduce them now because they might be used in programs later on. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and if you have any doubts, please feel free to leave them in the comments.